All the attendees trickle in. Hello, everybody. All right, I think we are ready to roll. My name is Josh Blackman. I am a law professor at the South Texas College of Law in Houston. It's my honor to be here today to talk to you about the pandemic and the Second Amendment. I had hoped when we booked this several months ago, the pandemic would be almost over, but here we are. So we'll do the best we can. The constitutional debates over the Second Amendment are well known. For gun control advocates, firearms are dangerous and should be restricted to promote the public welfare. But for gun rights activists, disarming people is dangerous because firearm ownership promotes the general welfare. The Supreme Court has given few hints on how to resolve these conflicts. Rather, in the decade since District of Columbia versus Heller, the lower courts have settled on a framework akin to intermediate scrutiny. Virtually all these Second Amendment cases have turned on a foundational question. How much danger does the weapon pose? But in 2020, the courts were suddenly presented with a novel constitutional question. How much danger does obtaining the weapon pose? This was a new question. During the COVID-19 pandemic, state and local governments enacted complete prohibitions on the acquisition of firearms, complete bans. Willing buyers were ready to comply with all extant gun control regulations. But these governments shuttered firearm stores completely. How could such a regime comply with Heller? These policies were adopted not to stop the sale of guns, but to stop the spread of the novel coronavirus. Stores deemed non-essential were closed to promote social distancing and reduce touch points. Remember that touch points? That was a thing for a while. But stores deemed essential could stay open, often without any restrictions on capacity. In short order, these governments deemed the Second Amendment as non-essential. The ability to purchase firearms was treated differently than the ability to purchase other conveniences. Suddenly, Heller's framework proved quite unhelpful. That landmark decision focused on whether a weapon was dangerous, not on whether the process to obtain a weapon itself posed a threat to others. In 2020 and 21 and 22, merely standing in line became a dangerous act. Coughing became a lethal weapon. Heller did not countenance such novel restrictions on a foundational right. Still, the practices in the overwhelming majority of the states reflected what should be a basic tenet of constitutional law. Enumerated fundamental rights must be essential rights. And the state cannot impose an absolute and arbitrary prohibition on the exercise of the essential Second Amendment. This talk will proceed in four broad parts. First, I will consider what the word essential really means. Few scholars have considered this phrase before the pandemic, but overnight, the line between essential and non-essential became a matter of life or death. And governments did not constrain the definition of essential to those goods that sustain life. Rather, governments deemed as essential businesses such as liquor stores and casinos that were hardly life-sustaining. Yet those same governments deemed as not essential the free exercise of religion, as well as the Second Amendment. Ultimately, the word essential merely represented a value judgment of what the government thought was important. Second, I did a survey of restrictions imposed on the right to bear arms during the pandemic. The overwhelming majority of states deemed firearm sales as essential. 4 states initially deemed firearm sales as non-essential, but reversed their policies without litigation. 3 states deemed firearm sales as non-essential, but after being sued, these states refused to defend their policies in court and promptly deemed firearm sales essential. 2 states defended their ban on firearm sales as non-essential. After being sued, they defended their restrictions and lost in court. Finally, 2 states deemed firearm sales as non-essential. They were sued and they prevailed in court. The third part of my talk analyzes another metric to decide whether the right to bear arms is essential: the people. During the COVID-19 pandemic, gun sales surged. Indeed, sales skyrocketed by more than 100% in states that deem firearm sales as non-essential. If these states had prohibited all sales of firearms in March of 2020, the number of daily sales would have dropped to 0. Hundreds of thousands of people who deemed acquiring a firearm as essential would have been unable to exercise their rights. Nationwide, during civil unrest, millions of Americans viewed the acquisition of firearms as essential. The fourth part will revisit 2 decisions that upheld restrictions on the right to bear arms during the pandemic. These cases follow the framework that Chief Justice Roberts established in South Bay Pentecostal Church versus Newsom. Under the so-called comparator approach, firearm stores can be closed as long as other types of comparable stores are also closed. But the Second Amendment, an enumerated fundamental right, must be deemed essential. These courts should have followed the framework from Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo. If any businesses are treated as essential, firearm stores must presumptively be afforded the same status. The right to keep bear arms ought to be afforded most favored status. Specifically, the government would have to answer a different question. Why does a gun store pose a greater risk of transmission than other retailers are allowed to open? Right? Why is a gun store more dangerous than Walmart with respect to COVID? And the state must justify its decision to deprive people of the right to keep and bear arms. The COVID pandemic, I thought, was drawing to a close, but who knows? Maybe it's not. We seem to be stuck in Groundhog Day for the last 2 years. The precedents established during this hectic period will hopefully be short-lived, I hope. Yet, the experience we've had, I think, reaffirms 3 truths. First, in times of conflict, the people seek arms to protect themselves. Second, in times of conflict, the government will seek to prevent the people from arming themselves. Finally, in times of conflict, the courts will not stop the government from disarming the people. Going forward, legislatures should take steps to ensure that emergency powers cannot be used to infringe on the essential Second Amendment. All right, let's start off by talking about what is essential. What's essential? Some candidates are obvious. People need grocery stores to eat. Okay. People need hospitals to receive urgent medical treatment. Okay. People need police departments to provide public safety. Agreed. People need sewage treatments to maintain public hygiene. We all agree there. But let's not lose sight of the fact when a service is deemed essential, then employees at that institution are required to report for duty. As a result, both customers and workers are at risk of infection. But I think as society, we say that these services are worth the risk. That's not much praise for a person who's working at an essential plant if they're exposed to a fatal disease, which was the case for many people in the last 1.5 and 2 years. Other candidates are less obvious as essential, but still persuasive cases. People may choose to eat in outdoor seating at a restaurant, but could just as well eat at home. People may need goods from hardware stores. People could wash their clothes in a sink, but laundromats are more effective. Still, other services are far from essential, but seem very useful for people. Pets are important, but let's be frank, you can get by without a pet shop. Stylish wardrobes might be trendy, but clothing stores are not an urgent necessity. Car dealerships provide a useful service, but they could stay closed at least for some period during the pandemic. There are other modes of transportation available. And other services yield the opposite effect of life-sustaining. Liquor stores, tobacco stores, marijuana dispensaries. These entities are probably injurious to the public health. Nationwide, governors had maximum flexibility. They possessed virtual carte blanche to determine whether some, most, or all these businesses were essential. There was no need to justify why certain services were included, but others were excluded. Moreover, as the pandemic ebbed and flowed, formerly non-essential businesses were suddenly deemed essential, often with little or no justification. Governors made up the rules as they went along with good reason. No state had ever confronted a pandemic like COVID-19. I think it was salutary that states had the flexibility to make these judgments on an incremental basis. This sort of approach is far more desirable than a top-down federal 50-state solution. Still, in hindsight, many of these stringent rules were arbitrary. I'll give you one of my favorites. Pennsylvania allowed life-sustaining businesses to remain open. But this phrase cannot possibly be taken literally as life-sustaining. That is, people without the service would die. For example, Peeps. Think about Peeps, right? The little marshmallow candies for Easter. The Peeps factory in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was allowed to remain open. The governor deemed the popular marshmallow candy as life-sustaining. Peeps may be tasty on Easter Sunday, but are not necessary to save lives. Here, the word life-sustaining, like essential, merely represents a value judgment about what the government thinks is important. Next, I'll turn to sorts of the limits imposed on firearm sales during the COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, several states allowed all businesses to open. There were no restrictions on businesses. These jurisdictions did not establish elaborate matrices of what was and was not essential. For example, South Dakota authorized all businesses to remain open, but suggested that the size, of gatherings should be limited. The Mount Rushmore state did not define what businesses were essential. As a result, proprietors were allowed to decide for themselves whether to stay open. Alaska allowed all non-essential businesses to stay open so long as they could maintain social distancing requirements. But these states were outliers. The majority of states divided businesses into three rough categories. Some essential businesses could remain open without limitations. Other non-essential businesses could remain open with limitations, and other non-essential businesses had to close altogether. Many of these orders restricted firearm stores. Historically, gun control laws were premised on the notion that guns are dangerous. But the COVID-19 measures were different. Firearm vendors and firearm buyers were willing to comply with all extant regulations. Rather, the government addressed a different risk to public safety. People could transmit COVID-19 in the process of buying firearms. Different states took very different approaches to the regulation of gun stores during the pandemic. And I'll give you my 50-state survey here. Excuse me. 19 states expressly designated firearm stores as essential activities. Illinois, Hawaii, Indiana, Louisiana, Ohio, West Virginia, Idaho, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Montana, Rhode Island, Kansas, Arizona, Tennessee, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Colorado. I think it's 19. So 19 states deemed firearm sales as essential. 2 states did not designate firearm stores as non-essential that were required to close. In other words, they could stay open. Oregon and South Carolina. 6 states followed guidance from the Department of Homeland Security, and that agency designated firearm stores as critical infrastructure. Alaska, Georgia, Missouri, Texas, Maryland, and Minnesota. Okay. The laws in 2 other states, Kentucky and Nevada, prevented governors from treating firearm sales as non-essential. These laws were enacted in the wake of Katrina after Louisiana started seizing firearms from people. The state government said during an emergency, the executive cannot restrict firearms. Good laws, I think. 2 states, Virginia and North Carolina, deemed firearm sales as non-essential, but allowed the gun stores to open under restricted conditions. Not quite done yet. In Texas and California, cities and counties tried to prohibit gun sales. I'm looking at you, Austin, but didn't work. Under state law, it's preempted. California cities were allowed to. 4 states initially deemed firearm sales as non-essential, but they reversed their policies without litigation. Maine, Vermont, Washington, Delaware. 3 states initially deemed firearm sales as non-essential. However, these states refused to defend their policies in court. Rather, they promptly deemed firearm sales essential. New Jersey, New Mexico, Michigan. I'll come back to those in a bit. 2 states, Massachusetts and Connecticut, defended their bans on firearm sales. They were sued and they lost. Then we have 2 states, Pennsylvania and New York, which deemed firearm sales not essential. They sued and they prevailed. Pennsylvania quickly repealed. New York kept the laws in effect for a while. I want to talk about New Jersey, because New Jersey, I think, is perhaps the most obnoxious of, sorry, I'm from Staten Island. I think I have some agency to say this, but New Jersey is the most obnoxious of all the states where they handled this situation. New Jersey would put out a policy, get sued, rescind the policy, then put out a new policy, get sued again. This repeated over and over again. Effectively, New Jersey was saying is we don't want to defend our policies in court. We'll keep putting out these sort of short-term fixes, hoping, praying that some judge will uphold it. But as soon as they got sued, they withdrew. They never even filed a brief in defense of their policy. So here's the iteration, right? First, the governor of New Jersey said all gun stores must close, right? In Jersey, the only way to buy a gun is through a gun store. He was sued. His AG never even filed a brief. Never even filed a brief to defend it. They withdrew the policy. Okay. At the time, gun sales were spiking in New Jersey and across the country. People, by and large, deemed themselves necessary to have a gun in light of all this uncertainty in the world. All right, so the first policy was challenged in court, and then the governor rescinded it. Then he put another policy in place that restricted where you can go target shooting. He was sued again, never defended it, withdrew the policy. One more time, he had a policy about outdoor shooting ranges. He was sued, never defended it, withdrew it. So there wasn't much ground to actually prevail on those cases. He was willing to simply run away and ignore it. Massachusetts also initially prohibited the sale of firearms. A federal judge in Boston entered an injunction that you can't completely ban the sale of firearms. Connecticut did something a little bit different. Connecticut said, okay, we're not going to restrict the sale of firearms. We're just going to make it that you can't get one. In Connecticut, to get a gun, you need to have your fingerprints checked. But they ordered all the local police stations to stop taking fingerprints to promote social distancing. So it became impossible to get your fingerprints, and thus impossible to buy a gun. They were sued. The state lost, and the court said you can't prohibit altogether the collection of firearms, the collection of fingerprints, if it makes it impossible to get your gun. All right. Then we go to the 2 states that actually prevailed. The first one was Pennsylvania, which I already mentioned before. Pennsylvania had a weird law where the governor had this elaborate matrix, a spreadsheet that said this business is essential, this business is non-essential, and it was arbitrary. To this day, in discovery, the governor can't explain why some things were on the list, some things weren't. It was completely arbitrary. There's also a lot of favoritism, right? Certain businesses that were favored were given special treatment, exemptions. There was so much rampant corruption. I'm sorry to digress a bit, but when a government has basically unchecked, unfettered discretion to decide which businesses are allowed to open, which are not, this is going to be subject to cronyism. It makes me very angry. Putting aside the gun issue, businesses that are friendly with the government made phone calls and they got on the list to open up. This was not done properly. Okay, rant over, as they say. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued a ruling in late March of 2020. So really after the pandemic began. The court split 4-3. They said, we're not going to intervene now, but there were 3 dissenters saying, if you ban gun stores altogether, you're violating the Second Amendment. Shortly after that ruling, the governor of Pennsylvania rescinded his policy because he didn't want to get sued again. He realized he was going to lose. But then you have New York. Oh, Governor Cuomo, who's no longer in office, but Governor Cuomo was in office at the time. New York did something strange. They didn't ban the sale of guns. They just said, you can't have a gun store, but you can have big box stores. So if you want to go to Walmart or Dick's or one of the other sporting goods stores and buy a gun there, that was fine. But you couldn't buy a gun at an actual gun store. This policy never made much sense. And it's to be frank, it's not clear that people actually have their rights violated. I suppose you couldn't go to the gun store of your choice, and not sure if that's a right or not. But this was always a sort of a weird regime because New York did allow the sale of guns, unlike some of the other states. The court upheld it. And the court said that the states are allowed to impose these policies. All right, there's your survey. Let me move on to the third part of my talk. During the COVID pandemic, gun sales surged. The Brookings Institute in DC observed, quote, when Americans are concerned about their personal safety, they buy guns. It's true. The organization analyzed the number of background checks performed by the FBI. These numbers are highly correlated with the number of firearm sales. The United States does not record firearm sales. We looked at background checks as a decent proxy of that number. So let's just get some history. In January and February of 2020, daily gun sales varied between 80,000 and 100,000. So again, in January and February, about 80 to 100,000 daily gun sales a day. On March 13th of 2020, the president issued a proclamation that declared a national emergency. We're coming up on the second anniversary of that real soon. This order marked a turning point in the national conversation about the pandemic. Over the next dozen days, firearm sales surged, jumping to 120,000 per day. And on March 16th, 3 days after the pandemic declaration, there were 176,000 gun sales that day. Brookings observed that this spike was not correlated with COVID death rates or an increase with unemployment. Rather, the spike in firearm sales resulted from a general sense of apprehension, rather than a response to deterioration in local conditions. In March, nearly 2 million guns were sold, according to the New York Times. The FBI reported that the period from March 15th through March 22nd recorded the highest number of background checks since it began keeping records in 1998, more than 2.4 million in the span of 7 days. In 7 states, governors deemed firearm sales as non-essential. California, Delaware, Michigan, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, and Pennsylvania. The people of those states disagreed. In each of those states, gun sales surged. In California, they increased 33%, Delaware, 63%, Michigan, 108% increase in sales from the prior year, New Jersey, 30%, New Mexico, 45% increase, New York, 70% increase. If these states had prohibited all sales of firearms during the month of March, the number of daily sales would have dropped to 0. Hundreds of thousands of people who deemed acquiring a firearm as essential would have been unable to do so. This surge in sales can also be addressed qualitatively. On March 16th of 2020, the New York Times observed that many people were choosing to buy a gun for the first time. Nearly 20% of Americans who purchased a firearm in 2020 were first-time owners. One North Carolinian had never bought a gun before, but decided to purchase a 9mm handgun and an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle. Why? He feared, quote, that the virus could lead to a breakdown of public order with looting and robberies. With, quote, everything shutting down, society just won't have any sense of lawfulness anymore. A gun store owner explained that people have little lack of confidence that something big and bad happens, that dialing 911 might not work. Another gun store salesperson said, there's just an overall feeling of fear, of being stranded, or having to be isolated to protect their home, if God forbid supplies become limited and people start looting. Customers told a gun store clerk in Virginia, we're going to be locking down. We're constrained to our homes. We want to keep safe. There was a viral photograph from Los Angeles. It showed a line of people outside of a gun store stretching around the corner. One buyer in upstate New York listed as essential goods, toilet paper, antiseptic spray, and lotions, plus a couple boxes of ammo. During times of civil unrest, millions of Americans viewed the acquisition of firearms as essential. In Heller, Justice Scalia wrote that the Second Amendment guarantees, quote, the right of law-abiding, responsible citizens to use arms in defense of hearth and home. The early days of the pandemic proved Justice Scalia correct. All right, now I want to move on to the fourth part of my talk and explain how there are two ways to understand the right to bear arms during a pandemic. Excuse me. During the pandemic, many states imposed restrictions on houses of worship to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The Supreme Court articulated two general approaches to understand the free exercise of religion. The first approach was advanced by Chief Justice Roberts in South Bay Pentecostal Church v. Newsom. Under this comparator approach, the state must treat houses of worship similar to comparable secular gatherings. But the state does not violate the Free Exercise Clause by providing preferential treatment to dissimilar secular gatherings. Moreover, the challenger has the burden to challenge the reasonableness of the government's judgment. The second approach was articulated by Justice Kavanaugh in Calvary Chapel v. Sisolak. The Supreme Court later adopted this approach in Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo and Tandon versus Newsom. If the government granted any preferential treatment to secular gatherings, it presumptively had to give the same preferential treatment to religious gatherings. It was irrelevant whether the gatherings were comparable. In short, the free exercise of religion ought to be afforded most favored nation status and treated no worse than non-religious assembly. And the government has the burden to defend the reasonableness of its regulations. These two frameworks can also be extended to the Second Amendment context. Under Chief Justice Roberts' comparator approach, firearm stores can be closed, so long as other types of comparable stores are also closed. For example, non-essential gun stores can be treated the same way as non-essential electronic stores. But essential liquor stores and marijuana dispensaries can stay open. And the challenger would have to contest the reasonableness of the government's judgment. Both Justice Kavanaugh's approach, firearm stores must remain open if any other type of stores remain open. Stated differently, if any businesses are treated as essential, firearm stores must presumptively be afforded the same status. The right to keep and bear arms ought to be afforded most favored status, and the state must justify its decision to deprive people of the right to keep and bear arms. Two federal district courts upheld closures of firearm stores. These courts in California and New York channeled the South Bay comparator approach. They found that firearm stores were comparable to other retail establishments that were shuttered. These courts did not treat gun stores as presumptively favored in light of the Second Amendment. But under the Calvary Chapel approach, the state would have had a much higher burden to justify these infringements on the Second Amendment. And I do not think these governments could have met these burdens. Let's start with California. In the early days of the pandemic, Alameda County, California closed all firearm stores. Prospective gun buyers challenged the order. The district court rejected this challenge. It acknowledged without much difficulty that the order impedes plaintiffs' right to use arms to defend their hearth and home, and it burdens the core Second Amendment right. This analysis was not premised on whether the Constitution confers a freestanding right on commercial proprietors to sell firearms. Rather, the plaintiffs in these cases alleged a right to acquire firearms, not sell them. Next, the court found that the burden was severe. For someone who does not already have a functioning firearm at home, the order makes it virtually impossible to exercise the Heller right for as long as it is enforced. But the court found the government demonstrated a reasonable fit between the burden the order places on Second Amendment rights and defendants' goal of reducing COVID-19 transmission. The court did not require the government to show that the law was narrowly tailored. In other words, the county did not need to demonstrate why less restrictive alternatives, like those used in other retail settings defendants considered essential, cannot be applied to firearms and ammunition retailers. In short, adding these retailers to the list of essential businesses exempted from the order would increase the risk of community transmission, even when social distancing protocols are followed. The government did not need to offer any evidence why firearm stores could pose a greater risk of the transmission of COVID than other exempted stores pose. What about other essential businesses that were allowed to stay open, such as grocery stores, pharmacies, laundromats, hardware stores? Why are these businesses essential, but firearm stores are not? The court said that the government had a convincing reason to draw these lines. They provide for the basic needs for residents for food, medical hygiene, and shelter. But that reasoning leapfrogs the question of what needs are basic. The court did not grapple with Heller's recognition that the Second Amendment was a fundamental right. The Altman court viewed the right to keep and bear arms and its attendant right of self-defense as a trifling convenience rather than a bedrock constitutional pillar. Altman, decided only 3 days after South Bay, did not discuss Chief Justice Roberts' concurrence. But this form of intermediate scrutiny closely tracked the comparator approach. The court treated firearm stores in a similar fashion as the court treated other non-essential retail outlets. And the government was not obligated to explain why it treated firearm stores less favorably than other essential businesses. Merely stating that grocery stores and the like are essential does not demonstrate why the exercise of an enumerated constitutional right is non-essential. Here, the county did not credit the need of residents to defend their homes as basic. The next Second Amendment case did rely on South Bay. This is Dark Storm Industries versus Cuomo. New York did not prohibit the sale of all firearms. New York permitted big box stores like Walmart to continue selling guns. Still, all businesses that sold exclusively firearms were affected by the closure order. Gun stores were deemed non-essential. Despite this prohibition, people in New York were still able to purchase firearms during the pandemic. In April of 2020, more than 27,000 background checks were performed in New York. This analysis in New York differs from the analysis in Alameda County, California. New Yorkers still had the ability to purchase a gun, but they cannot buy a gun at the preferred store. As a result, people may have to travel further or use a non-preferred vendor. Dark Storm Industries was a retailer in New York, and they challenged this regime. The federal district court in New York ruled against Dark Storm. The court found that the government could deem firearm stores as non-essential. The state could accomplish its goal of slowing the spread of COVID-19 by requiring all but the most essential businesses to close or operate remotely. But how does the governor decide what is and is not essential? The court stated that measures such as executive orders that seek to reduce the face-to-face interaction of all New Yorkers fit tightly with the state's goal of slowing the spread of the disease, and thus survives intermediate scrutiny. Indeed, New York argued that even entities with constitutional dimensions like houses of worship and political organizations can be deemed non-essential. But why is the risk of transmission to buy a gun in Walmart acceptable, but that risk is unacceptable in a much smaller firearms store? Indeed, smaller stores could restrict customers to one at a time. Walmart cannot. The court did not find the answer to this question relevant. The court explained with candor that would not second-guess the state's policy decision. New York, the court found, could seek to minimize opportunities for a disease to spread while making a policy judgment that certain limited exceptions are warranted. The court credited a state official who described how exceptions to the executive order were allowed for providers of services that were essential to human life, such as food, beverage, shelter, healthcare, transportation. However, the definition of essential businesses was not limited to those necessary to sustain life. The category was much broader. For example, realtors and auto dealers were deemed essential to ensure people have access to housing and transportation. There's a level of attenuation. On one level, essential refers to specific services that are life-sustaining. On a second level, essential refers to ancillary services that allow you to obtain life-sustaining services. The state conflated level 1 and level 2 essential services, but the court did not question this mismatch because the means and the ends were close enough. The court acknowledged that the state might also have allowed firearms stores open and would have been justified in doing so, but the state was not required to make this decision. When more businesses open, the court observed, there will be more opportunities for people to interact, which would increase the spread of the disease. At bottom, New York made a policy decision, but which businesses qualify as essential, which did not. The district court took its lead from Chief Justice Roberts in South Bay. The court should be loath to second guess those policy decisions about what is and is not essential. Given the facially neutral orders and no evidence that the state sought to single out firearm dealers, the lockdown measure passed constitutional muster. But now we go to the Supreme Court. In a case called Calvary Chapel, Justice Kavanaugh found unconstitutional Nevada's COVID restrictions on houses of worship. His approach has two steps. First, the court should ask whether a law fails to treat religious organizations as part of a favored class of organizations. For example, were houses of worship allowed to hold meetings in the same fashion as casinos? If so, second, the government must prove with sufficient justification why the religious organization was not treated with favored status. Justice Kavanaugh's position, however, was in dissent. The court upheld Nevada's regime. In November 2020, the court decided Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo. This case declared unconstitutional New York's restriction on houses of worship. Roman Catholic Diocese did not overrule South Bay or Calvary Chapel, but I think Roman Catholic Diocese interred South Bay. And there's little daylight between Justice Kavanaugh's Calvary Chapel dissent and the Roman Catholic majority. The court made the shift clear 5 months later. In April of 2020, the Supreme Court decided Tannen versus Newsom. This case halted California's complete prohibition on indoor worship. Here, the court formally adopted Justice Kavanaugh's most favored right framework from Calvary Chapel and found the restrictions were not neutral and generally applicable. In Calvary Chapel, Justice Kavanaugh had no occasion to discuss the Second Amendment. But in his prior role, then Judge Kavanaugh drew analogies between between the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. Here, I will try to extend the Calvary Chapel framework to the COVID-19 restrictions imposed in the stores in New York and Alameda County. Under the Calvary Chapel approach, the Second Amendment should be granted something analogous to a most favored nation status. In the context of international trade, a country afforded most favored nation status under a treaty can enjoy the same privileges that the treaty accords other countries under similar circumstances. For example, if a treaty grants country number one a benefit, Country number 2 with most favored status gets the same benefit. What exactly would most favored nation status mean in the context of the Second Amendment? Generally, the government defends gun control measures based on the risk that guns pose to public safety. But the COVID orders differed. In California and New York, buyers and sellers would comply with all exempt gun control regulations. Rather, the state asserted a different safety rationale. Merely buying a gun in accordance with law increased the risk of spreading COVID-19. There was nothing specific about buying a gun versus buying other regulated items that created a bigger risk of transmission. As a result, Heller's usual framework for assessing the validity of gun laws was a poor fit. So let's start with the regime in Alameda County, California. In that county, certain retailers deemed essential could stay open, but gun stores were deemed non-essential and were shuttered. Under the first step of the Calvary Chapel framework, we asked if gun stores are treated as part of a favored class of organizations. Here, the answer is no. Some retailers were allowed to open, but gun stores were not. It is irrelevant whether the government deems stores as essential. The very enumeration of the right takes out of the hands of the government, even Alameda County, the power to decide on a case-by-case basis whether the right is really worth insisting upon. That's from Heller. In short, the right to keep and bear arms must be presumptively essential. But what if the government does not treat the Second Amendment as essential? Under the second step of Justice Kavanaugh's Calvary Chapel dissent, the government has the burden to prove with sufficient justification why gun stores were not afforded this favored status. In the district court, Alameda County provided evidence to show that expanding the number of essential businesses could heighten the risk of transmission. Adding these retailers to the list of essential businesses exempted from the order would increase the risk of community transmission, even when social distancing protocols are followed. This fact, however, does not provide any justification why gun stores were excluded from the list of essential businesses in the first place. This argument merely states a conclusion. Under the Calvary Chapel dissent framework, the county would have to answer a different question. Why does this gun store pose a greater risk of transmission than other retailers that were allowed to stay open? In other words, why were gun stores not given the most favored nation status? The government would struggle with this burden. Perhaps there's some evidence that people buy firearms are less likely to wear masks or maintain distancing. The government would need to introduce evidence to justify this disparate treatment. But it would not be enough to merely declare firearm stores as non-essential, QED. The New York case presents a different analysis. Stores that only sold firearms were deemed as non-essential. However, big box stores that sold guns like Walmart were deemed as essential. The first step of the Calvary Chapel framework is more complicated. Without question, New York's laws made it more difficult for people to purchase firearms. There are fewer stores with less inventory. People may have to travel further to buy their desired arm. And buyers may have a special relationship with a shutter facility. Still, I am not sure these burdens would amount to treating the Second Amendment as a second-class right. If the Second Amendment only secures a right to purchase arms, then the New York regime would not make it to step 2 of Calvary Chapel. There's perhaps a simpler position. Small gun stores were treated less favorably than small food stores. In either event, I'll presume for present purposes that the Second Amendment also protects the right to sell arms, independent of a right to buy arms. In this case, New York's policy would fail the first step of Calvary Chapel. Stores like Walmart that sell guns and other goods are essential. But stores that focus solely on firearms are not essential. Here, the Second Amendment wouldn't quite be a second-class right, but it wouldn't be a first-class right either. The right is disparaged. Now, the second step of Calvary Chapel becomes very difficult. Alameda County could at least offer a unified position. All gun stores must be closed because they pose unique risks. But New York allows larger gun stores to operate, but not smaller gun stores. This distinction defies common sense. First, the state can no longer grant distinction based on the unique process to obtain a gun. A buyer would have to spend the same time buying a gun at Walmart as he would at a private gun store. Given that paperwork and background check processes are standardized, both stores would require the same amount of face-to-face contact and touch points. Second, the risk of transmission would seem smaller in smaller stores, which can restrict the number of customers. By contrast, larger, big box stores open without restrictions. They cannot easily limit capacity at the gun counters. For example, a gun store could allow one customer at a time, but Walmart would have hundreds of customers at a time. A federal court in Pennsylvania made a similar observation. Pennsylvania allowed big box stores to open, but small stores stay closed. The judge wrote, "It is paradoxical that in an effort to keep people apart, the government's business closure orders permitted to remain in business the largest retailers with the highest occupancy limits. Logically, it would make more sense to prohibit gun stores at big box stores, and permit them at smaller stores where the risk of infection was reduced." Third, Walmart and the gun stores were selling the exact same products. The state cannot argue that the unique dangers of guns renders them non-essential if they can be sold in the big store, but not a small store. The Pennsylvania federal court also observed another layer of arbitrariness inherent in the business shutdown components are that many non-life sustaining businesses sell the same product, perform the same service that were available in stores that were deemed life sustaining. In short, New York could not provide any substantial justification to explain this burden on the sale of firearm retailers. Heller tells us that the Second Amendment must be an essential right, and the state cannot arbitrarily deprive people of this essential right. Even during a pandemic, the Second Amendment should be given most favored status. The government must justify its decision to treat these rights less favorably than mere commercial interests. All right, let me wrap up. I'm almost out of time. The COVID-19 pandemic, I hope, draws to a close in our lifetimes at some point. Fortunately, few precedents were set. Most governments recognized that the right to bear arms was essential, and most governments that tried to shut down firearms first quickly relented. Still, courts in California and New York were content to treat the Second Amendment as a second-class right. These decisions were abetted by Chief Justice Roberts' South Bay framework, which treated the Free Exercise Clause as a second-class right. Fortunately, the Supreme Court has interred South Bay, but the lower court precedents concerning the Second Amendment remain. As the pandemic fades soon, hopefully, I think legislatures should become proactive. The state should define the sale of firearms as essential, and states should prohibit governors from restricting sales of guns during declared emergencies. The laws from Kentucky and Nevada should serve as models. The COVID-19 pandemic has illustrated once again that in times of crisis, the government is content to stand between people and their arms. The people must be vigilant to protect this essential right. Thank you so much for your attention, and I welcome your questions. And you can put them in the chat or whatever you'd like to do, or raise your hand up, whatever works. No questions. Nothing. Did nothing I say have any loose strings? Nothing? Alex, anything from you? Okay. Good seeing everybody. Have a wonderful new year, and maybe I'll see you in person sometime soon. Thank you.